Hello everyone, this is our fifth class so far, at least the first presentation, and today we're going to talk about the frontiers of Central Asia because we've already covered the encounters of European cultures with non-European cultures of Asia, Middle East, and even Latin America. Right, so today we're going to focus on the experience of Russia and China in the steppes of Eurasia, which is going to be particularly relevant because a lot of the students here at Webster will be from a Central Asian region. And unlike today, Central Asia back in the day used to be a lot larger, right? It used to be everything from where you guys are situated today, including even Kazakhstan and portions of China, up to Crimea. So this vast territory, most of which today is occupied either by Russia or by new states that are not particularly fully represented by the people who are inhabiting this land, especially due to the fact that a lot of the people back in the day were nomadic, right? So the governments and countries today residing at this area are not particularly corresponding with all people that have been roaming the land. And Russia and China are not. Um, it's not a coincidence that we chose both of them for this one because they both built great empires between 1600 and 1800. China started a little earlier, so for China, it is even, before that as well, just slightly before that as well. But Russia, yes, actively started to build its own empire in everything from 1600 up to 1700, because from depending on which ruler we'll be focusing on, we would see that they've been focusing on their own portion of expansion, right? Ever since starting with Ivan the Fourth, right, have been very active with his expansion to the east, and uh, this empire building of these two nations was not a simple matter of conquest. They just conquer and expand, uh, and the conquests that they have been conducting not just tell the whole story of these two nations and their encounters with the people that they've met. Instead, both states had to deal with people of the Eurasian steppe for a long time. And these people have been spread across this huge expanse of Central and North Asia and Southeastern Europe, and all of them had their own peculiar traditions and cultures. Today, this area consists of Ukraine, Crimea, and many former steppe kingdoms including Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, Mongolia to the east. To the north, the vast lands of modern-day Siberia were sparsely populated, but communities with whom the Chinese to the south and Russians to the west would be trading for animal furs or any other goods that will be in value. Both China and to a great extent Russia's relationship with the inhabitants of these people was shaped not only by the encounters with these dispersed and fragmented societies, but also by their struggle to meet the challenge of the empire being formed by the steppe peoples under the leadership of its own people, the Mongols. But not only just by the Mongols, right? Um, Um, and Mongols occupy a good portion of this presentation today because their history has led to a very particular phenomenon, right? In 1200s, a semi-nomadic steppe people, the Mongols, they were united by Genghis Khan, a guy that all of you guys obviously know. The Mongols lived in an area that they say is just north of Beijing in a separate nation called Mongolia. There was the Pope horsemen, feared warriors. The Mongols, they invaded Central Asia. Uh, Eastern Europe, Middle East on horseback. They even tried to invade India, and they also even tried to invade Japan, believe it or not, because again, to invade Japan, you need to swim, right? You need ships. The cavalry tactics was superb. Military organization was unmatched, really. It was at the same time very easy and at the same time extremely effective, right? With both of these things combined make it a great military tactic. The communication system that they've been using permitted them to establish systematic connection between the incredibly faraway parts of their own incredibly large empire. Um, and their empire was obviously probably one of the biggest land empires in the history of humanity because it stretched, it far outshined the Roman Empire and the conquest of Alexander the Great. It was far bigger because it stretched from China, Persia, and up to the territory of Europe, right? So the Mongol invasion of Eastern Europe stretched all the way from Poland and Ukraine. Um, that is a considerable amount of land. You're going to see that in the next picture. Look at this, right? Half of the continent, the biggest part of the continent, really has been conquered by them, with the exception of India, Southeast Asia, and Japan for a variety of reasons. But portion of the Middle East was conquered by them as well. Um, the Mongols were the most powerful and menacing invaders the Russian and the Chinese have ever known, and they struck terror throughout Europe and the Middle East as well as Asia. If leaders insulted Mongol diplomats or resisted the conquest, they would typically be executed by being wrapped in carpets and trampled to death underneath Mongol tents or yurts. And the Mongols might then also slaughter the inhabitants of the city-state that has given them such an offense. Um, Even as the Mongol Empire collapsed, its remnants remained very powerful. In Russia, settlements were heavily taxed or assaulted, and Russians were often taken as slaves. Though known for their ferocity and war, Mongols brought great peace and stability to the vast multicultural empire. They reopened and provided complete security for the legendary Silk Road across Central Asia to Europe, which had long before fallen into disuse. Throughout the revived Silk Road, success came at a price, really, because of renewed these renewed connections. They also have enabled the spread of the Black Plague from China to Europe, dealing devastating blow to in the form of several pandemics to the European societies where millions of people died because of the Black Plague. This is the portrait of Genghis Khan. As you can see, he's portrayed in largely Chinese manner. At all the classes that we had, I would ask people, okay, what strikes you the most about this picture? And the people who would typically, be used to looking at Genghis Khan as a typically Mongolian Central Asian figure, I would be like, he's portrayed in a very Chinese manner. It's like a Chinese man, typical Chinese man. The truth here is that Mongols and the Chinese, again, the Chinese themselves would be mostly referring to Han people, but there's a variety of Chinese people, right? And typically what we call Chinese is this umbrella term for a variety of ethnicities that live together and, a series of smaller kingdoms that then throughout history have united and under the, one empire. And even the so-called dynasties would typically come from different parts of China, so ergo different people in China. So Mongolians, if history turned differently, Mongolians could have been just this, another version of Chinese people. In this sense, even Genghis Khan, who conquered, um, his descendants conquered China, just openly called themselves Chinese emperors, right? So even though the traditional, the supreme best version, the prime Mongol Empire, it was very short-lived. It broke over the quest to find a successor to Genghis Khan, which was an uncanny task. Its memory has been colored by the terror it inspired. Its political and cultural legacy was profound despite the violence. Instead, people inherited Mongols' political organization and used the Mongol term Han to now the ruler and Khaganate to describe the territory. They were divided into small political units comprised of so-called khanates, which were the divisions created by the Genghis Khan, who needed to divide his Western Empire to parcels and give these parcels to his sons to control them. With that, they held together in confederation called the Golden Horde. But this soon split apart into rival states. Each khaganate had its own nobility and local notables led individual villages and clans. The steppe people inherited another characteristic from the Mongol. Their societies were often very well organized for war. That means that in a lot of those communities would be fully nomadic, and for them, jumping on a horseback and all of a sudden deciding that we're going to go raiding was normal. The herding lifestyle was very well suited to be, to be supported by raiding, because again, the nomadic people would be living mostly in steppe or semi-desert environments, which were very harsh, and in order to replenish that, in order to compensate for these harsh environments, raiding, and which is basically very fast, right? You go in, you take what you need, you get out, or something to sustain them in terms of money in terms of gold or any other luxury items that they would need. Um, to that end, steppe tribes were able to produce large trading armies. The Kalmyk Khan, for instance, not the most strongest Khaganate out there, the Kalmyks were able to gather an army of 40,000 horsemen, and the Crimean Khan, which was uh, basically the most powerful one for hundreds of years in the territory of this greater Central Asia, uh, was believed to be able to to gather at least twice as much, at least 80,000 um, horsemen, which was an incredible amount of warriors back then. Therefore, the encounter between the steppe people and the Russians to the north continued to be quite violent and destructive even after they broke out from the Mongol rule. Um, Again, another example of how people living in these harsh environments would support their lifestyle by raiding would be Vikings in Europe, right? The guys have been living not in a hot environment, but in a very cold environment where farming was quite problematic. So in order to compensate for that, they would be raiding nearby territories where farmers were a lot more common, and farmers would be a little more rich compared to, and well off compared to the people who'd be living in Norway and Sweden, right? For them, of course, that was a way to earn additional riches. Um, okay, what about the Russian Empire and the people of the steppe? I already mentioned that um, Russians suffered from the expansion of the Mongol Empire and have been under Mongol rule for about 200 years. And in traditional history of Russian expansion, the people we believe that the people that the Russians encountered have been rendered non-existent. They were considered to have no significance because, with the exception of Crimea, they did not possess the centralized, like Russia, but rather nomadic warriors organized by a tribe, right? There's no centralized state, there's no centralized organization. They're typically nomadic people. So for the people who are used to live in a normal state system, which is based on cities and then villages. It's a settled lifestyle, settled farmers, with cities where people typically settle to do all sorts of things, including trade, including uh, craftsmanship, etc. They would encounter people who would occupy certain territory but be nomadic in the sense that they never had any cities. The villages would be here today, not there yesterday, and somewhere else tomorrow. For Russians, that would probably mean that's a no man's land. The man ripe for the taking. Uh, and quite oftenly, the Russian expansionist forces after 1700s would see those people as unable to change and develop, would consider them to be lacking in progress. By the end of the 1700s, Russia was engaged in a very active conquest campaign. It has already expanded far to the east at that point. However, in the early period of encounter of 1400s and 1500s, Russians weren't expanding. Russians weren't conquering this so-called no man's land, right? They were mostly on the defensive from those people that they later would believe to be, lacking in progress. So who were these steppe people? Why did they engage in sustained aggressive encounters with Russia over several centuries? The steppe frontiers was composed of a patchwork quilt of different peoples, many of whom were descendants of Mongols who had conquered this area in the 1200s and then mixed their blood with the conquered ethnicities. The people of the steppe consisted of a larger and smaller political units and a combination of nomadic, semi-nomadic, and urbanized societies. So Nogais, Kalmyks, Kazakhs, in the western part of the steppe formed successive nomadic confederations in the 1500s and up to 1700s. These were tribal groups bound by kinsmanship and military alliance. They raised animals on the steppe and moved with the changing pasture land, thus falling into the category of fully nomadic people. Other people of the steppe formed city-states such as Bukhara, Samarkand, Crimea, even, right, and Kazan, right? Those would be considered to be urban dwellers, right? The territories and the Khaganate that would resemble to the maximum any state out there in Europe or the Russian principalities. Samarkand, Bukhara, or south of the Kazakh domains, just north of the modern-day Iran, as I don't have to explain that to you. The Crimean people are a powerful state located on the large peninsula. We also know where that is. And all of those have been quite actively looking at Moscow and looking at the progress that these people have been making, the riches that they've been piling up, and the people, as those people would quite oftenly be taken slaves and sold at the markets like Kaffa and Crimea. This is Afrasiab, which is Samarkand. If you look at this, this looks exactly the same compared to any typical city-state of that time. You would take European, let's say, take Serbia, right? We have a bunch of Serbia professors at Webster. Take Serbia and Belgrade, there is pretty much the same fortress. And it looks just the same because, again, there's not much difference in the urban life back in the day. It's not big because mostly in 15, 16, 1400s, people would be living in, far away from these cities, right? For by modern standards, that would be just towns, tiny towns, right? But back then, those were considered to be big cities because there's not much to do there. The traders, yeah, okay. Um, if you would be doing, I don't know, craftsmanship, blacksmithery, anything, yeah, sure. But then most of the people will be concentrated in the villages because farming, right? Farming gives you sustenance, farming gives you agriculture products. Most of those countries were agriculture back then. So it wouldn't be, very different. Um, the Crimean Peninsula was an important trading point on the Silk Route that brought precious goods from China to Europe. The Genoese and the Venetians originally had trading posts here, but later on the Ottoman Empire, with the Ottoman Empire taking advantage of that and conquering Constantinople, of course, Europeans lost their access to the profitable Asian trade. The people of the city-state still practiced nomadic pastoralism at times, although others were merchants and traders. Quite often they would be more influential and a lot richer. The Cossacks was a completely different group who were powerful interlopers. While most steppe people were unrelated to the Russians ethnically or religiously, the Cossacks were Slavic people who lived as independent farmers in the area of modern-day Ukraine and southern Russia. Why did they live there? Because they were rebels and outlaws. They escaped, mostly escaped, serfdom, right? So that was pretty much a time where free people, normal, just ordinary people in Russia would stop being free, and all the people aside from royalty would be in serfdom, right? So they would lose their freedom, they lose their liberties, and they would be in need of service to the royalty. And those who didn't want to do this escaped and were outlaws. They automatically became outlaws and were supposed to be brought back, as in any good form of slavery. But in order to escape that, they went into this nomad land, right? The land of nomadic people. And in order to survive then, because that was a very dangerous place, they needed to become a danger on their own, right? And they quite oftenly would adapt to the local fighting styles, to the local strategies, the local traditions at times, right? And the Cossacks, this is why they're light cavalry. The only light cavalry Russia had were the Cossacks because they particularly adopted what the Mongols and the people who've inherited this from Mongols have been doing, right? This light cavalry that shoots, just, lunges. It's a very fast attack, shoots from afar on a horseback, and then, it goes back and, nobody can touch them. They're very mobile, they're very aggressive, and they're a very powerful force. So these Cossacks, at some point, they used to be a problem for the Russian authorities, but then the empire decided that it is an important ally because all of a sudden there is this buffer zone between these steppe ethnicities, the steppe people, and the Russian borders, and they started to serve as sort of a border control. Um, the people who were officially they normally they lived there and that was it, but they were considered to be a part of Russian military. So whenever there's a war, the Cossacks would mobilize. They would go to war. They would be the avant-garde of all the Russian conquest, and especially down south when fighting with the Ottoman Empire. Um, and yes, they became the powerful allies because of that. And while there wouldn't be any wars, they would come back to their own houses and farms. And excellent horsemen and field warriors, they served as the Russian vanguard as a light cavalry. There's the picture, and you can see the resemblance, especially in their dresses. Those dresses do resemble, in a lot of ways, what people of Caucasus region would typically wear in the mountains, especially the hats, right? They ride on horseback and they have rifles, and they would also have an alternative to yatagan, right? They would have a saber, um, again, which they would master, of course, in combat, and absolutely no armor, super light cavalry, because they need mobility. Again, something that they've inherited from the people of the steppe, where they were forced to live. So when it comes to Russia's frontier, it both shaped the politics and society and was shaped by Russians' accelerating expansion into the area. At first, in the 15th and 16th centuries, Russia had to defend its borders from marauding tribe to the south because they would typically go in, they would plunder, they would burn, and they would take everything that is of value, including people, to sell them again in the internal slave markets. But most of the Slavic slaves would then happen to go to Kaffa, where most of the money would be paid for them. Later in the 18th century, 1700s, it is typically, the turning point is Peter the Great, right? Who had defeated the Swedes and has, even though he originally lost the war against Ottoman Empire, was, held hostage and basically at the gunpoint had to sign a treaty claiming, never again. Was basically rescued by his wife. Despite that, there was a clear sign of the ambition of Russia to expand down south. Um, and Starting with that moment when Russia turned into the empire, not the kingdom, but the empire, Russia consolidated control of its borders, it began to dominate its frontier regions, expanding into what they believed to be no man's land. Once severely threatened by the nomadic tribes, Russia slowly forged itself into the empire, and since then the expansion to the east, south, and southeast became very active. Unlike the European powers that at this point in time they stopped expanding and conquering the new territories, wouldn't add them to their own empire. They typically so to pursue expansion via colonialism, this new fashionable concept. Russian empires expanded the old-fashioned way, adding, annexing these territories and attempting to civilize or partially assimilate the conquered ethnicities. Now, it is important to say that there were two types of conquest, which you would not, by the way, see in the book. The first one is what we said when they've been expanding south and southeast at the expense of the nomadic people, right? And what typically happened to these people is that if we would look at the modern territories of Russia, most of the South Russia, up until the regions that are basically the Caucasus, right, North Caucasus mountains, all of these people living there would be Russians who are also Christian. What does that mean? It means that the people that have been settling there were Russians. Russia expanded and have resettled these territories with their people, and the nomadic tribes and ethnicities had to go somewhere else, being pushed out by largely expanding Russian military. What happened with the eastern expansion? If we go to the east, we will all of a sudden find all sorts of Turkic people living in Russian Federation. Most recognizable of those groups would be Tatars living in Tatarstan with Kazan, right, which is an ancient city, a very beautiful city today, very important in Russia today as well. But we see Tatar people who are today both Muslim and Christian. And that is another approach that they started to use because they understood at some point that forcefully trying to civilize these people, which also included the conversions into Christianity, didn't really help. So they gave a choice, much just like the Ottoman Empire, if you would think about this, they would give them a choice. You can remain with your own religion, there's no problem in that. But if you want to participate, if you want to get rich, if you want to participate in state affairs and occupy governmental posts, you should be Christian, right? So hence a lot of Tatars, for instance, have switched. They've transferred to Christianity, and some of the most influential noble families would be Tatars, right? It would be, for instance, Yusupov. The Yusupov's family, one of them, by the way, killed Rasputin, closer to the revolution. But Yusupov's family was probably the richest noble family and most influential one in the history of Russia, and they're all obviously Tatars. Um, in that sense, Kalmyks, Burats, all these other people, they've been retaining their religion mostly, And for this reason, we have all these people living in this called national republics of Russia. They have limited autonomy, as Russia right now is not very democratic. It's not very, it's a very centralized country. But yet again, these ethnicities live there. It's not the Russians that are populate these areas. In some of these uh, parts of the country, Russians would be the minorities. So anyway, uh, and this is the consequence of that, right? It's a totally different approach, a lot more tolerant and a lot more functional, rather than just squishing people out, settling everything with typically white Russian Christian population. So this is the map of the steppe societies, just to show that this is the Khaganate of Crimea, which basically all those territories went up to Nizhny Novgorod, Moscow, and Kiev, right, very close to it. So even Kursk would be under the Crimean Khaganate, right? Modern day Kursk. We would go here. There's the Azov right now would be Khaganate of Astrakhan, right? And the Nagaisk people, Khaganate of Kazan, the Kazakhstani people will be somewhere there, right? So most of Russian territory back in the day would be under the control of the steppe people. And this is why the raiding was so, because of the border was so huge, this is why the raiding was such a big problem, because it would be all these different people who would be, Bashkirs, for instance, they would also be raiding Russian territory. China and Mongolia. So that's a whole other example, but sort of, there are similarities here if you take a look at this. So far to the east on the border of Western China, Mongolia, another encounter took place involving China, Mongolia, and Russians. In the 1400s, as the Mongol Empire disintegrated, destroyed by internal rivalries, the Ming Dynasty arose at the foundation of Yuan Dynasty, which is the Mongol dynasty. Um, that had been ruling China for 30 years. A very brief time, but very influential. So the Ming Dynasty initiated successful military campaigns against the remnants of the Mongols. Ming military leaders took advantage of the split among the Mongols themselves and tried to use the classic divide and conquer tactics. They consistently allied themselves with Eastern and Western Mongols to fight between one another and automatically fought on each side. Once victorious, they would shift their allegiance and would then fight against their former ally. Um, However, this strategy took place in the early 1400s and was successful in controlling the Mongol threat for a very short period of time. Very soon, the Mongols have gained, the control of their territory, started to, integrate more, started to collaborate with each other more, and started to pose a much more significant military threat to the Chinese. The situation, because of that, reversed, and the weakened Ming dynasty suffered a humiliating capture. One of the emperors during one of the military campaigns in 1449 already. Eventually, he was released and regained the Chinese throne, but still, the strategy toward Mongols became defensive because of that. The Chinese stopped being able to do anything meaningful, militarily against the greater Mongol forces, and even had to resort to rebuilding and revitalizing the Great Wall of China, expanding it and strengthening it again in attempt to ward off Mongol attacks. The Ming Empire, they needed horses. It complicated the encounter with the Mongols because the only horses they could get were from the Mongols, right? So how are you supposed to fight somebody if the only source of your cavalry would be supplied by them? The Ming traded tea for horses, and a huge amount of tea was shipped westward in exchange for horses. And that was a great, very valuable good. But unfortunately, the type of horses that they got wouldn't be the best one. And again, it's very hard to ship horses for such long distances, so that was ineffective. The Ming's inability to conquer the Mongols meant that the west borderlands of China were uncontrolled and became the classic frontier region between the 1500s and 1600s. For 100 years, Chinese soldiers and merchants spoke Mongolian and other nomadic languages and intermingled freely with these people, trading tea for horses, would quite often convert to Islam, or you know learn Arabic or the languages of these people. So there would be this uncontrollable borderland region where the cultures would intermix. China went through another conquest, this time by the Manchus. People to the northeast of their traditional lands were swept through China in 1640s, and this was the end of the Ming Dynasty, which was a turning point because at all of these dynasties, they typically change in China because they start good and they start typically almost always as as a revolution. Somebody revolts against the ruling dynasty, they throw them off and they take control, they take the crown, and they become the new dynasty. These people, right? They form a new dynasty, and it typically goes for about 150 to 100 to 100 years. So for a long time, the dynasty would go on and be effective. But the more it develops, they start good. They introduce rules that would be very efficient. They start upholding the law. They make the society more effective, less corrupt. But at the end, the dynasty itself falls itself onto the corruption, despite the fact that all of these dynasties would be fostering um, Confucianism. They would then turn away from that Confucian way, right? Because of uh, people who are not supposed to be decision makers influencing decisions, because of corruption, because of widespread poverty, um, other weaknesses that appear out of nowhere, or not really nowhere, but they, other weaknesses, including military weaknesses. The Manchus installed themselves under the new Chinese dynastic name of Qing, right? It's king in English because they don't have ts as a sound. So, but just be sure Qing is this, this is Qing, right? So this was the dynasty that reinvigorated, reorganized the Chinese army, which then engaged in imperial expansion that carried it westward into Tibet. Because before that, the previous dynasties were not very well organized for conquest. The rules and the constraints in military made the centralized power of Chinese emperor more significant, but inherently weakened the warlords, generals, and military on its own. Earlier, the Manchus had formed alliance with the Eastern Mongols through trade and use of the Mongol writing system, and have been having, lifelong, generation-long contacts with Mongols. So the Mongols would trade with them, and the Manchus would trade. They would share experience, they would share military technologies and strategies and tactics. And this alliance helped them to conquer China because they did not have to worry about Mongol attack on them. So China, Mongolia, and Russia, again, they all at some point appear in one geographical space. All of those interests collide. The 1600s, Russian expansion eastward ran up the Mongols, showing off their empire, but still formidable and around their homelands. Russians also began to approach the limits of the Chinese empire, thus sandwiching the Mongols between Russia and China. So the Russians, marching eastward and the Chinese marching west, possessed similar expansionist goals, acquiring wealth derived from the trade and tribute and securing their frontiers. The Russians wanted access to Chinese manufactured goods such as silk, porcelain, also tea and everything else China could have potentially offered, but Chinese wanted the furs that the Russians had for its growing domestic market, and that would provide them a perfect grounds for cooperation, wouldn't it? But when two empires approach one another, and there's another power, like the Mongols, also on the scales, it does lead to conflicts rather than trade. Like the Russians, the Chinese wanted Mongols and other tribes they encountered to pledge allegiance to their ruler, the Emperor of China. But the Chinese did not force the people to convert to a new religion, as Russians did at times, not always, but at times. In part, this is because the religion of Mongols, Buddhism, was an accepted and popular religion in China. But at that moment in time, the Mongols have devoted themselves to Tibetan Buddhism. Has become prominent in Western Mongolia in 1600s. Mongol aristocrats offering their sons to the monasteries in Tibet. In particular, Zayat Pandita, son of Western Mongol leader Baibagas, studied in a Tibetan monastery and became a devout Buddhist monk. Also took an important political role as influential unifier of Mongol tribes in 1600s, because Buddhism was this thing that allowed them to unite the fabric of Mongol society together, being different tribes and peoples into this one more um, consolidated nations. Mongols rallied around this Buddhist religious identity then. As an answer to that, Mongol tribes aimed to play off China and Russia against one another, and it was a smart move, and it worked for a good period of time. Mongol chieftain Gen Timur joined Chinese forces in 1653 to fight the Russian troops, and upon being victorious, he then eventually allied his people with the Russians because they offered better food, supplies, and military protection. Later, Galdan, also another powerful Mongol prince, attempted to play the Russians and the Chinese against one another, unified Mongol people into one state called Jungar Confederation. It was a big state, however, very short-lived because it's at its prime, at its the most territory that they controlled. It only lasted for several decades, but then the territory of it nearly halved. So Galdan requested that Chinese officials visit his headquarters to collect the tribute he wanted to give to China. He proposed a middle ground approach by using the Chinese diplomatic rituals instead of Mongol rites that had been used before. He also sent lavish tributes of 400 horses, 60 camel, and etc., etc., etc. A lot of riches just to, sweeten the deal. The middle ground approach worked, though only temporarily. In a divide and conquer strategy, Chinese diplomats agreed to support Galdan to help him conquer his Mongol rivals. Why would they support Mongols who they are in conflict with? Isn't a divided Mongol nation easier to fight against rather than a united Mongol nation? Their idea was exactly the opposite. Because they cannot deal with all of the Mongol princes, they never knew what to expect. You deal with one prince and you think you've settled everything and they're not going to attack you, so you can focus on your other affairs, but all of a sudden they do, and all of a sudden that's just some other Mongol prince that have united people against you. So it would always be unpredictable. With one Mongolia, right, with one Mongol state, they would be able to predict what would happen because they would have a relationship. They would be able to build relationships because you build the relationship with one prince. The next thing you know, he's dead. Somebody else is in his place. And you have to do everything again. So, um, and again, both sides had their own interests and cooperation. Galtan wanted support against Mongol enemies to, expand his control over the Mongolian people and the territories of the Jungar Empire, to consolidate it and to be more considerable, more powerful state. And again, the Chinese prefer to deal with one ruler instead of 13 or 20. But both sides understood this middle ground approach is temporary. It is going to end at some point, and in a few years, they would be still back to war. So this is the extent of the Jungar Empire. You can see that they're really sandwiched between the two empires, and you would see that this darker green is the temporary is the significant territory that they had, that they remained until the very dissolution of the Jungar Empire. But here it's an additional, if we would go take both of these territories, they would be quite a significant territory. But they lost this territory in 1720. So only after 3 years. Um, this is how the Jungar people would look like, and you look at them and say, doesn't look very Mongol to us, right? It does appear to be in a lot of ways Chinese, right? And the Chinese writing system right here would only support that claim, right? When Russians and the Chinese gathered at the Russian frontier town of Nechchinsk in 1689, they intended to more clearly demarcate the mutual border to avoid unnecessary confrontations. So after decades of fighting one another, would have the Mongols on each side from time to time being allies both to the Russians and to the Chinese. Um, Finally, the Chinese and Russians were like, why don't we just meet, face to face directly and discuss, well, what kind of problems do you guys have with us, right? And vice versa. And then the set of negotiations where some Jesuit priests took a very active part on the side of China. The parties agreed to a treaty that had no role for the Mongols, and thereby that was the end of the Mongol influence in the regional balance of power. And basically, no middle ground approach since then would be possible. To put an end to this middle ground strategy, and then after several years, the Mongols would be wiped off, and there would be no separate Mongol state. It is interesting to outline that the Jesuits were there, right? Who particularly were very um, they served, but again, they're Christians, right? They're Europeans, they're Christians, they know of Russia, so they'd probably be able to speak the languages that the Russians were also able to speak. So the culture differences would be minimized, but also the way that these negotiations were proposed, excluding Mongolia and the Mongol people, is very typical for the people of Europe, right? To in their future encounters that we'll cover in the other lectures, you will see how Jesuits quite often were cunning and quite often dangerous because of that sort of approach, where they would neglect the needs of less powerful nations and people. But yes, they sort of offered this approach to exclude the Mongol interest, and it worked. Um, The resulting agreement helped China focus on destroying Galdan for good, assuring that the Russians, of course, wouldn't intervene and save him. In the following years, they hunted him down, they destroyed his army, and they established Chinese power over the western frontier for good. And like the Russians in Central Asia, they abandoned any pretense of establishing a middle ground approach and instead emphasized Chinese dominance over the Mongols. Uh, Conclusion here is very simple. Those both empires started out being afraid, controlled, vilified, conquered, and dominated by the steppe people, starting with Mongols, and even after that, the steppe societies would be immense to them because they'd be equipped for war. They would be having raiding as a normal part of their life and economy and development of their people, while these, less powerful people, there would be settled people living in Russia or China, building cities, farming land, developing their own territory, would be then quite often the subject of those raiding armies, large raiding armies that would be very hard to fight against. But as soon as these people started to get competitive advantage, right? They started to get better technology. They were able to consolidate the power, um, circle up, more people for military. They were able to go from the defensive into the offensive, reshaping this sub-region of Greater Central Asia that we used to have. Now, as we know, Central Asia is a very compact. It is still a big sub-region, but it's now a lot more compact than it used to be, because again, a lot of its territories are now legitimately controlled by Russia or by China. Um, and this is your homework, guys. So the reading is very simple. It's a very short one. Just keep in mind that the authors writing about it are Western authors, so they might not understand some of those things that you guys would be, as people living in Central Asia, would probably know pretty much from birth. So again, be understanding on that. There's 6 questions that we're going to discuss when we meet face to face, screen to screen during our online discussion session. And yeah, that's pretty much it. But do not forget to watch this. Out of all these 3 videos, I would suggest that you guys at least watch the first one, How Russia Conquered Central Asia. It is sort of long, but again, I do believe that you guys living in Central Asia, most of you, would probably have some use for it, some interest of, how did Russia become so powerful that they would just take over and conquer these large territories and subjugate a lot of the people that have been living here. This is it for the lecture today. Thank you very much for participating, not participating, but for watching this. We are an important announcement. I will also add that to the announcements on Canvas. We're also approaching our midterm. This is the lecture number 5, if I'm not mistaken. So in this sense, we're already crossing the border. It's almost at the half of our uh, subject. We're already going to be closing at least 50% of the course. You're going to have midterm based on that. What does that mean? The midterm would be most likely multiple choice, and it would happen sort of online. Means that you do connect to teams as normal, and instead of having just a point discussion, what we would be doing, I would open a test in Canvas that would be closed before, would be unpublished before, and you would have a certain amount of time to do this test, right? There will be, I think, anything from 20 to 40 questions, depending on how much of, how many points I want to give for each question. And you guys would be doing it right in front of me. It would be specifically timed. So, if you miss it, you miss it. That means be on time. This next meeting that we're going to have, when you have the announcement, no, we are supposed to do this in class. You cannot do this any other time. I will not open it for you any other time. I'll specifically have it during class, then I will lock the access to that assignment, so no one else will be able to contribute. If you miss this, I might give you a chance to retake that, but be aware it is going to be with late submission penalty. So, once we're done, Thank you guys very much. I'll see you in the next one.